welcome back.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. I missed you last week.
I missed you this morning. So we're even now.
Okay, got it. Good afternoon, and thank all of you for being here. We don't have a lot in the way of new announcements this week, but a couple of updates. As you all probably know, last week I sent a letter to the task force that's meeting to study comprehensive tax and budget reform. The task force that came out of, I think it was House Concurrent Resolution 11 in the special session, asking for early recommendations. I hope and expect to get those by the middle of this month, and those recommendations will assist me in crafting an agenda, a call if you will, for the next special session, which I still anticipate to start in June, very shortly after after the regular session concludes. Also, wanted to announce that on Monday, I've got some staff members from the governor's office who will be traveling to St. Joseph to discuss water issues and the efforts of the administration to fix those problems. And we did have some developments last Friday, I believe it was. The Fiscal Review Committee recommended appointing a fiscal administrator to move long overdue project along. There's actually 3 different phases of that water improvement project, and a total of $7.8 million that are available through 3 sources. Some of it CDBG, some of it capital outlay, and then also the Delta Regional Authority has some emergency money, but all of which requires the production of an audit, which the town of St. Joseph has not been successful in doing. And so we're going to go up there and let them know where we are as an administration in their efforts to fix those problems. And with that, I would open it to questions.
Two quick questions for you. One for our viewers in New Orleans. They'd like you to state your position on the sanctuary city bills, and you can certainly tell those bills as well.
Okay. The sanctuary city bill is a bill that obviously there are some things about it that I like, and I believe that the author has good intentions, Representative Valerie Hodges. I believe that we ought to cooperate with federal law enforcement, and I think that ought to be the rule. My concern is that New Orleans is one of the 2 municipalities in the state that I believe are currently would not meet the requirements and would be designated a sanctuary city. And as I understand it, it emanates principally from a consent decree that is binding upon them. And yet the bill makes no exception for that. And so that is a concern for me, and it would seem like we ought to be able to make some accommodation for court judgments, consent decrees, things of that nature, because we're talking about some very serious sanctions. The loss of money coming from the state, capital outlay from the state, and that sort of thing. So I've got real concerns about the bill in its present posture. I know it came off the House floor last night. It's on the way over to the Senate, and I'm hopeful that they will be able to address that. Quite frankly, I also have some concerns about, I think it vests too much discretion in the Attorney General, and I don't believe that's principally a role that he ought to play or that office ought to play, and so there ought to be some adjustments there as to what agency, entity, or just how we go about putting that designation on a municipality.
I also have a question about the progress of your education package.
Yeah.
Story on that today. Today we have a compromise that came out of the Education Committee, but at the same time, it seems like efforts maybe to curb the expansions of charter schools hasn't been so successful. How would you say the progress of your education package is going? Because some would say it hasn't been going as well as you planned.
Well, it's not going as well as I'd like because I have things in my package that have yet to move out of committee. And I'm not going to stand up here and pretend otherwise. But the fact of the matter is there are some positive things that are happening around content standards, which will probably be adopted formally in August of this year after school has already started in for the next academic year. And so delaying the accountability by a year makes sense, and that's something that we're advocating for as well. There are other things around the way we evaluate teachers and reducing the value-added method, the VAM, to 35% of that evaluation, that is something that I have promoted as well. And so we believe there's some positive movement on the education front. I do think, I'm not changing my opinion as it relates to vouchers. They ought not be available to kids who would otherwise attend a C school or an ABC school, I should say. And I do think that districts that perform well under our own accountability system ought to be given the autonomy to operate and make final decisions about whether new charter schools open in those districts. Obviously, there's a majority of the House and Senate Education Committees who disagree with that. I believe that those bills would be much better received by the Senate and the House as a whole, and that those committees don't really reflect the makeup, but it's the structure that we have to work with. Tyler.
Yes, Governor, I have a question on the budget. I'm hearing a lot, particularly in the House, of members who say, why should we vote for a budget with tough cuts, particularly cuts that are going to hurt our constituents, and then vote and turn around and vote for revenue measures that will fill those cuts? So what are you telling those members who are simply saying, hey, we shouldn't even vote for the budget during a regular session?
Well, first of all, it is tough. Nobody recognizes that more than I do. I had to present that budget, and I didn't send Jay Darden to do it for me. I went to the House of Representatives, to the Appropriations Committee, and did it myself. And we have a tremendous shortfall, as you know. Tyler, I keep saying it because you don't always print it, but I inherited the largest budget deficit in this state's history. But not as often as I say it. But it's true, and we've done some good work, and through cuts and through savings and efficiencies and through revenue, we have whittled that down from $2 billion to about $600 million. But it is impossible to fashion a budget that adequately funds critical priorities when you're short $600 million. I didn't enjoy presenting the budget that I presented, but I'm obligated by the Constitution to do that, to present a balanced budget. I did it in the most responsible, the most transparent, honest way that I know how to do it. But it still wasn't a document I was particularly proud of. So I understand the angst of lawmakers who are concerned about voting for a budget that looks like that. I would just ask them, where was that angst when we were in that first special session, because we could have done our job a little better, a little more thoroughly, and we wouldn't be in that position. But we are where we are. At the end of the day, I think the most likely outcome is the House is going to pass a budget. It's going to go to the Senate, and as happens in almost every case, the Senate will pass a budget. There will be a conference committee, and the differences are going to be ironed out. But it's not going to be a budget that everyone likes, and I think it's going to produce enough concern across the spectrum that we will have a sense of urgency about fixing the situation. And that's why I still believe a second special session is in order. And I know there was some reporting that I may be changing my mind about that. I am not. There is no reason to believe at present that the May 12th Revenue Estimating Conference is going to put enough additional revenue into the forecast that we won't have to have that special session. My point is that no one in the state of Louisiana would be happier than me should the Revenue Estimating Conference do that. And I have heard some legislators say that they want to wait and see what RAC does because they believe there will be some additional revenue. I hope there is. I hope there's a lot of additional revenue. I don't believe that's forthcoming. Yes, ma'am.
On that same subject, Stephen Wagsback put out a column saying June was too early for the special session. I spoke with Cameron Henry a little while ago, who said he thought that was too early because of that issue of waiting to see how much money was actually raised from the bills passed in the first special session. And they both seem to think that there need to be a few more months of collections in order to figure that out. How do you respond?
Well, first of all, my response would be what it was yesterday. I suspect that that's similar to the counsel that Mr. Wagisback gave Bobby Jindal over the years that resulted in many years of mid-year budget cuts because they were going to wait and see and hope rather than take a responsible, honest look at the situation at the outset. We have a revenue estimating conference for a reason. It tells us how much revenue we should expect over the year, and then that's what we budget to. If it's telling us that we're $600 million short, and I don't know what the number's going to be after May 12th, the most responsible thing to do is to assume that that number is correct. Now, is it going to be exactly correct? No. It's going to be a little bit high or a little bit low because that's the nature of forecasting. But it is the best estimate that we have, and that's what we should do. The second thing about waiting, come July 1st, we're in the new fiscal year. And in order to have a balanced budget based on the revenue that's available, the cuts are going to start. At present, I've got 4 safety net hospitals that are not in the budget. Another $46 million cut to higher education for the 8th straight year, cuts to higher education. $50 million cut to K through 12 schools, $183 million short on tops. I don't think we need to wait till September to take action on that. That would be the most irresponsible thing to do. Yes, ma'am.
Governor, obviously, you are the enemy when it comes to certain members of the House and some with some influence on this budget. But what have you been hearing that they are considering doing, because the word is they want to fully fund TOPS? What have you heard that they might be considering doing with shifting the numbers to make that happen so they get a budget bill that's balanced?
Well, I haven't heard of anything that they want to do that would produce a balanced budget to do that. Now, they have floated this idea of reducing contracts by $184 million. That's not going to work. That's pure fiction. Now, as Chairman Henry stated the day that I presented the budget information to the Appropriations Committee, that committee and this legislature certainly has the prerogative to move $183 million from other places and put it towards TOPS. But you're going to further expose other areas, other critical areas, to deeper cuts when you do that. I mean, do they want to leave other safety net hospitals out of the budget? Do they want to visit a larger cut to higher education, a larger cut to K through 12 education? Do they want to further impair the corrections department's ability to house inmates? So I don't know what they're going to do in that regard. I know that there's a lot of talk. I haven't seen a real plan yet. And of course, the budget, I believe, will be taken up by the House Appropriations Committee shortly after REC meets, and it'll be on the House floor, and hopefully on the way to the Senate soon enough that the Senate will feel like they've got adequate time to do their job. Anything else?
I'm curious what you think about Donald Trump being nominated for the Republican Party.
Well, it's hard for me to believe that's the best we can do. Yes, ma'am.
If the plan on TOPS was to maybe shift money around so that you could fund TOPS through the first half of next year, right? Like, I feel like I'm hearing from Representative Bentley, maybe we can move money around so that when we come into a special session next year, we can fund TOPS to get us to a special session in the fall. That's my interpretation of it. How would you respond to that type of plan?
Not well. We don't do half-year budgeting. My obligation isn't to have a balanced budget for the first 3 months or 6 months of next year. It's to have a balanced budget for the year. And it is my goal within that framework to have a budget that represents the priorities of the people of Louisiana and that adequately funds our critical programs. And his approach is I guess, the exact opposite. It's hard for me to imagine that a chairman of the Appropriations Committee would, and by the way, he hasn't said that to me, but it's hard for me to imagine that he really contemplates doing something like that.
One more question, last one.
I guess.
I'll ask one.
Okay.
On Senator Mills' medical marijuana.
Yeah.
thing, I understand that you supported it in its current form.
Well, first of all, I want it to be meaningful. I need it to be able to actually work. I personally know too many individuals, and really particularly children, who are suffering from medical conditions, and traditional medicines are not providing relief. And this is especially the case, for example, with respect to children with seizure disorders. And I quite frankly think that the state ought not be between the doctor and the parents when it comes to what might be best for those children. And I don't think that we ought to tell those parents, well, if you want access to what your doctor thinks is the best course of action, you need to move. So I need something that works. I'm also committed that we will not have creep, in the sense that this is going to be an ever-expansive list of medical conditions. I do support the idea that if the FDA releases a drug that effectively treats these conditions, then you can take them off the list if they're on the list of medical conditions for medical marijuana can be prescribed or recommended, whatever the terminology we're using. I think that that's appropriate. But it needs to be meaningful. It needs to work. I'm committed to working with Senator Mills and others to make that happen. But I am not willing to make this unavailable, continue to make this unavailable to people with medical conditions such as those that are currently in the bill, simply because I'm fearful that at some point it might lead to creep with respect to being available for other conditions. And there is no way, while I'm governor, and I suspect thereafter, that we're going to be legalizing recreational use of marijuana. And this is not a movement in that direction. We have lots of medications right now that are used for people that are the base of which are things that remain illegal. All right, I think that was the last question. Thank you all very much.